Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for coming. I'd like to start by saying how wonderful it is to be here. Is the volume okay? Okay. I graduated from Stanford almost 30 years ago, and it's really wonderful to have the chance to visit. I haven't been here in 25 years. So I'd like to thank Dr. Abbas Milani for the invitation, and Roma Prahad and Franco Errico for their superb organization for this visit. So thanks very much. Now, it seems a shame to, on such a beautiful day, to talk about National Socialism, but that's exactly what I plan to do, specifically the relationship between National Socialist Germany and Iran. So how can we characterize the relationship between Reza Shah's Iran and National Socialist Germany? Scholarship has focused primarily on their supposed political relationship, with works analyzing the ideological sympathies between the two regimes. Let me go 1 second. There we go. There we go. With works analyzing the ideological sympathies between these two regimes. So a shared authoritarianism combined with an Aryan ideology, which were thought to have created a political bond between these like-minded dictatorships. Now, the Nazi political outreach toward Iran began in 1933. The party established a branch in Tehran, and the propaganda ministry of Joseph Goebbels funded an illustrated magazine called Irani Bastan, which portrayed a Persian fascism on the march and a deep Aryan bond with Nazi Germany. So in that magazine, that's how the relationship was portrayed. Now, dignitaries paid state visits. The head of the Hitler Youth, Baldur von Schirach, went to Tehran in 1937, and the president of the Majlis, Hassan Esfandiari, made an official visit to Berlin in 1937. Reza Shah was known to be an admirer of Hitler. Yet, so that's the evidence that's given for some of the evidence given for the political relationship. I'm going to tell you that a lot of that, it's not wrong, but it's partial, because the political relationship between the two states was actually highly volatile. It started badly, with SA men attacking Iranian students on Berlin streets for supposed racial crimes, an event for which the Iranian foreign minister officially complained to the German Foreign Office. So that's how it started in 1933, and it remained fragile through the 1930s. So today I want to give you a different perspective on this question. And I will argue that the real driver of the German-Iranian relationship in the 1930s was economic. And it was based in the mutual interaction of state economic initiatives. It is known that the Nazi state pursued specific economic policies in the states of what were called the Northern Tier, Iran, Turkey, and Afghanistan, as a containment strategy toward the Soviet Union. But the relationship was larger than this. By the late 1930s, Germany's premier industrial firms, IG Farben, Krupp, the AEG, Siemens, Junkers, Lufthansa, Verstahl, Hochtief, just to name some of them, these premier industrial firms were all pursuing projects in Iran, including the building of the Trans-Iranian Railroad. By 1940 to 41, this economic relationship was at its height, with Germany in the position of Iran's foremost trade partner. The trade statistics are striking. So if we look at the level of imports and exports for Iran, in 1941, German imports into Iran made up 47.87, so almost 48% of the national total. So the total imports coming into Iran, 47.87 of those are from Germany. If we look at the export side, we see a very similar number of the total amount of exports in the Iranian economy. 42.1% of this went to Germany. So this is in 1941. So clearly, the two were important economic partners, and so I want to ask what made this happen. And as I will discuss today, this was the work of what was called the New Plan of Reich Economics Minister Hilmar Schacht, and the connections between this new plan and Reza Shah's strategy to modernize Iran. So I'm going to ask three questions. First, why did Iran become a site of German economic concentration in the mid-1930s, and how did this relate to Nazi plans as a whole? Secondly, how did Hilmar Schacht's plan for the global outreach of the Nazi economy speak to Iran's desire for national modernization? Because this is a mutual relationship, it's a two-way street. Third, how did this relationship change after 1939 and the start of the war? And a different way of putting the last question is to ask, what was Iran's place in the trade zone that was created by the Nazi-Soviet pact? So Nazi Germany's economic revival after 1933 fashioned a relationship with Tehran that spoke to the industrial and technological needs of Reza Shah's government. Now, this was Depression-era economics at its finest, and it operated in the highly uncertain international climate of the 1930s. At the core of this relationship was a new and a radical mechanism of exchange that was fashioned by Schacht. These are the clearing agreements of the Nazi system. They're central to Nazi economics. And these are the agreements that Nazi Germany closes with a whole row of modernizing economies, starting with Turkey in 1933. The agreement with Iran is in 1935. By 1938, there are 28 of these agreements. Now, the story of the Nazi clearing agreements is not well known. Nazi economics worked with the global trade system. In fact, it reordered that system. But scholarship on Nazi Germany operates often only within European parameters. So Turkey might be talked about, but almost never Iran, even though the statistics for Iran, the clearing agreement with Iran, are far more interesting than the one with Turkey. The numbers are larger. The share of German industry and Iranian industrialization is larger. But Iran, it's as if there's this Europe-Asia line that European historians draw, and now it'll include Turkey. Turkey will be part of the analysis, but they'll never go further east, so Iran or Central Asia will never be included, which is a shame. So I go past that. I don't draw that line. I go past that barrier. But that's one reason why this story hasn't been told. And on the Iranian side, a highly nationalist writing of history. Okay, so why is this story flown under the radar? Well, there are various boundaries. Sort of Nazi, the writing on, again, there we go. The writing, here we go. The writing on Nazi Germany is often Eurocentric. So that's one issue. And then on the Iranian side, this very highly nationalist writing about history often doesn't look beyond Iran's borders. So this means that the tale of the coming together of Hilmar Schacht and Reza Shah is not often told. And so it's this relationship that I want to look at today. So I'm going to start with this man here. This is Hilmar Schacht. He was born in northern Germany in 1877. He was raised in Hamburg. He was actually named, his name is Hilmar Horace Greeley Schacht. So his father was a fan of the United States and named his son Hilmar. So he has a Danish mother. Horace Greeley was after the editor of the New York Times. He has a Danish and American name. But anyway, he was very German, and he's known as the Dark Wizard of Nazi economics. He was the most unorthodox central banker of the time. He also has the distinction of being the only high Nazi official who had a systematic plan for the expansion of German influence into the Middle East. He starts his career as a young liberal, and he's the man who resurrects the German currency after the hyperinflation of 1923, and he's the director of the central bank during the Weimar Republic through the 1920s. By the end of the 1920s, however, he is a strong and vocal and important supporter of Hitler's rise to power, and he is then reappointed by Hitler as director of the Nazi central bank on March the 17th, 1933. On August the 2nd, 1934, Hitler made him the Reich Economics Minister. In this capacity, Schacht took on the central issue of National Socialist Germany, which was rearmament. Namely, how to find the money for such, and the huge quantities of raw materials necessary for the rearmament plan that Hitler had in view. So to this end, he unveils what he calls his new plan on September the 24th, 1934. So here we have Schacht and Hitler. Schacht is also instrumental for not only creating the engine that drives rearmament, but also the ways to hide it, to make it, to hide the fact that so much of Germany's resources, so much of its entire economy was being geared toward rearmament. And he also had a way of making Nazi Germany what the Germans call salonfähig, sort of respectable in the eyes of foreign governments. So he plays an incredibly important role in the regime and in building the regime. Now, historian Adam Tooze, in the best book on the Nazi economy, which is a book called The Wages of Destruction, Adam Tooze called the new plan, quote, a system of National Socialist economic management, end of quote. And this it certainly was. It does many things, all of which together added up to a radical restructuring of the German economy. So, what does it do? It asserts state control over the economy. It builds on the existing controls on foreign exchange and trade that had been instituted in 1931, and it builds these out. It centralizes industry behind the Nazi state. It forges bonds between the various companies and the Nazi party. And it's a very powerful engine for the building of the dictatorship and its war machine. Now, it finances rearmament in several ways, chief among them by reordering the country's international trade connections and the mode of payment. Schacht's new plan establishes a system of global exchange based in new relationships with modernizing economies. And this is the part of the story that's not very well known, because it's also not Eurocentric. It's about the global economy. This is a global trade outreach for raw materials, which takes in Southeastern Europe, South America, and the Middle East. Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. Now, clearing agreements are at the heart of the new plan, and raw materials are at their center. So absolutely enormous amounts of raw materials, which is what the Nazi economy needs. The thing is, they can't pay for them. So how does this work? How does this work? This is where the clearing agreements come in. They are to furnish Nazi Germany with the materials, both in type and amount, that Nazi Germany could no longer draw from Britain, France, or the United States. And the United States had been Germany's largest trade partner. So Germany is orienting away from the United States and looking for new partners. So for Germany's new partners, what do? Well, they provide a way to acquire German industrial technology, which was vital to acquire this German industrial technology for their own modernization. And all of this is going to happen without any foreign currency transfers. That's the key. So through the agreements, Germany would, and I quote, conduct foreign trade with most parties which did not demand payment in foreign exchange, but accepted German goods instead. Germany, without using currency, could purchase raw materials and foodstuffs of military importance, end of quote. So in short, the agreements are a kind of high-level barter. So this is not the interaction of markets with markets. It's not the interaction of businessmen with open markets. This is the mutual interaction of state agencies. The agreements funnel trade. There's this whole institutional complex that grows up around them in Nazi Germany and also in the other countries. The agreements funnel trade through very specific institutional channels. The central banks and the clearing agencies on each side, as well as organizations created to facilitate the transfer. So on the German side, with Iran, this is a group called the Iran Consortium and the German-Iranian Chamber of Commerce, to name just of the two institutions. Those two were created in 1935 and 36, respectively. On the Iranian side, a vital player are the state monopolies set up by the finance minister Davar. Now, clearing agreements do not have to be connected to war economies, but at their inception with this, they certainly were. Even though this was not, in a lot of respects, what Schacht was doing with regard to the Nazi economy was not known to his Iranian interlocutors. Now, the Nuremberg indictment against Schacht was one of the major war criminals put on trial at Nuremberg. He was acquitted. He was one of the three who was acquitted. But the Nuremberg indictment against him of 1946 described the clearing system as follows, and I quote, "The importer makes a deposit of the purchase price in his own currency at the national clearing agency of his country, which places the same amount to the credit of the clearing agency of the exporting country. The latter institution then pays the exporter in his own currency. Thus, if trade between the two countries is unequal, the clearing agency of one acquires a claim against the agency of the other." This device was used by Schacht as a means of exploiting Germany's position as Europe's largest consumer in order to acquire essential raw materials from countries which, because of the world economic depression, were dependent on the German market as an outlet for their surplus products. And end of quote. In his memoir, Schacht described the new plan as a way to solve the raw materials question for an export-driven economy. Schacht he's quite the liar. So this statement is deceptively simple. This is how he puts it in his memoir. It's deceptively simple as well as deceptive, because the new plan also aimed to detach as much as possible the German economy from its previous trade partners, chief among them the United States, while creating these new relationships with the economies of Latin America, Southeastern Europe, and the Middle East. It's very interesting. The clearing agreement with Brazil, for example, with this new relationship with Germany, Brazil is now able to default on its loans to the United States. So there are various ways in which countries that want to have some leverage against the United States then found something in the new plan. So the relationship between Germany and Brazil is quite interesting in this way as well. Now, the Nazi economic system is often talked about in terms of autarky, and there certainly were a lot of autarkic arrangements in which products which were imported or from other places are now the synthetic fuels and things like this, the upsurge in the German chemical industry in the 1930s, producing then things directly in Germany. So there are certainly a lot of these arrangements, but there are a lot of other arrangements too. The Nazi economy is certainly not autarkic in a large sense. And the clearing agreements were, in Tooze's words, and I quote, "a selective policy of disengagement directed above all against the United States, the British Empire, and to a lesser degree, France." End of quote. So in 1936, Hitler's special envoy, the diplomat Karl Ritter, wrote for the journal Foreign Affairs on, quote, "the possibilities of trade with the newer raw material countries which the clearing agreements had opened up," end of quote. He claimed that, quote, "German trade and industry would not have been able to reach and maintain their present momentum without the clearing agreements," end of quote. This is 1936, when rearmament was humming at a good clip, and the Rhineland had been taken and remilitarized. So there's no question that the agreements were successful. By Schacht's own account, by 1938, Germany was in possession of a 500 million mark surplus of raw materials and had closed agreements with 28 countries. These agreements with the Middle East have only recently received attention. Richard Evans's book, The Third Reich in Power, discussed the October 1933 agreement with Turkey at length. But as I've already said, if one looks further east to Iran, the picture becomes even more interesting. The numbers are more striking, the percentages of trade are higher, and the contribution of German firms to national industrialization are more apparent. So this last piece gives a hint of why Iran would sign on to this system. So I've been talking about what sort of this mechanism that's created for the German side and what it was to do for the German economy. But what was the interest in it? Why would Iran sign on to this? Well, during the war, the Nazis imposed draconian clearing agreements on European countries as a form of occupation economics. So that's during the 1940s. But during the 1930s, these clearing agreements were genuine contracts between states, even when between states with sort of large, different, there are different discrepancies of power. So what did Schacht's system offer to Iran? Well, various things. Most importantly, it spoke directly to Reza Shah's project to industrialize Iran while simultaneously disengaging from its largest trading partner, which was the Soviet Union. As Rouhollah Ramazani has written in 1933, quote, "The Shah made economic self-sufficiency by means of rapid industrialization a cherished objective of his government. German capital and technical know-how were sought to further that goal," end of quote. As each country was paying in its own currency, German industrial technology now becomes available and affordable in a new way, and it becomes a means for an industrializing Iran to now locally produce items which it had hitherto imported, and often from the Soviet Union. So Schacht puts this matter clearly to the assembled guests at an official dinner in Tehran in 1936, when he says, and I quote, "The fact that Germany produces everything that Iran needs and has an interest in its raw materials brings our countries to the realization that, for the benefit of both, a path must be found that simplifies the trading of goods and the modalities of payment," end of quote. So Germany and Iran signed their clearing agreement on October the 30th, 1935. The fact that 5 months prior to this, Schacht had been made by Hitler the general plenipotentiary for the war economy, this didn't need to be a factor to his Iranian interlocutors, and since it was a highly secret appointment, it's doubtful they would have known. It does give insight, however, into Schacht's energy and his motive in pushing forward this new relationship. Through the 1935 agreement, millions of marks of German industrial goods were to be exchanged for equally extensive orders of Iranian raw materials. So cotton, wool, seeds, fruit, nuts, nickel, copper, hides, skins, all kinds of things that all had a military application. All the skins and the hides, for example, go into leather that goes into shoes for the German military. Now, the Iran Consortium was founded a few days prior to the agreement. And on the German side, if you look just on the German side, the members are the Germany's largest coal and steel conglomerates, the munitions firms, and the construction companies. So Friedrich Krupp, the Guthoffnungshütte, the Vereinigte Stahlwerke, which was Germany's largest steel conglomerate, and a lot of others besides. In March 1936, the Reich Economics Ministry, the Foreign Office, and the Propaganda Ministry of Goebbels established the German-Iranian Chamber of Commerce. On the Iranian side, state trade organizations manage this relationship, and payments move through the Bank Melli. The Bank Melli is crucial to how this all works, and the Bank Melli had been founded in 1928 as a kind of German bank and had originally a German director, even though at the point of the clearing agreement and by the time of Schacht's visit, the director is General Khosravi, as the director of the Bank Melli. But that's the central institution on the Iranian side. Now, the head of the Iran Consortium, the German head, was a man named Liess, Herr Liess, of the Essen firm Feuerstahl, and he had excellent personal connections to Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Davar and to General Khosravi at the Bank Melli. So this personal relationship is very important. The relationship between Liess and Davar worked so well that the German officials in the legation in Tehran often caustically commented that business flowed faster through Liess's contacts than through the official channels of the legation, that basically the ministry was constantly being gone around and Liess would do everything directly through his personal contacts with Davar and with General Khosravi. But Smend, who was Hans Smend, was the legation secretary in Tehran. He could not complain. He didn't really like this, but he doesn't complain. For, as he wrote, Davar, quote, had clearly decided to place the lion's share of Iran's planned industrialization in German hands, end of quote. A March 1936 contract is kind of the first big contract that comes out after the signing of the agreement. This details Iranian orders for 80 million marks worth of industrial goods over a 4-year period. And in 1937, so what are a lot of these goods? Well, by the end of the 30s, a lot of it has to do with the Trans-Iranian Railroad, so locomotives, steel, and all kinds of rolling stock. So you see these big orders, but orders, the type of goods that are exchanged by each side, the lists are very long. All kinds of things are being exchanged. Now, in November 1936, Schacht makes an official visit to Tehran. This is the last stop in a kind of clearing agreements tour, which included visits to the Balkan states and to Turkey. He arrived on November the 20th, 1936 in Tehran, and he's met by prominent officials. Finance Minister Davar, Bank Melli Director Khosravi, Herr Ansari, who is the head of the European section of the Foreign Ministry, diplomats from the German legation, representatives of German industrial economies who were in Tehran, and even the leader of the Tehran Nazi Party, who happens to be a Russian German from Tbilisi, a guy named Dr. Ziems. The Russian Germans are actually kind of big in the Nazi Party that's in Tehran. So Davar hosted a glittering dinner for Schacht at the Club Iran, introducing Schacht to the president of the Majlis, Hassan Esfandiari, to cabinet ministers, and to directors at the Bank Melli. Impressive hospitality came from the Iranian state. Schacht and his entourage stayed in the Abbas Palace and were the first non-royal visitors to do so. A series of 3 formal dinners brought the Iranian cabinet together with the German representatives. Justice Minister Ahmed Matin Daftari was present, as was Minister Vasigi, who was the head of the Trade Department. An obvious and notable absence from all this high-level socializing was the Shah himself. He left Tehran as Schacht arrived, and this was planned. He was not present at the dinners and the discussions. He wanted to make the German minister come to him. Schacht complied with this, and he traveled 10 hours to Rasht to have an official audience with the Shah. As it happens, as the German documents and all these things are very detailed, so we learn that the Germans had to meet the Shah, and Schacht was very proper always in his dress, but they all had to meet the Shah in their traveling clothes because the car carrying their luggage had broken down on the way, so they didn't have any clean clothes. And while unplanned, this incident underscored the Shah's desire to stand above his visitors, to be seen as the equal or the better of his guests, because Schacht is the Nazi economics minister, but he is the Shah of Iran. So he is certainly the better of his guests, and he is the powerful ruler of an independent state. He was to be the partner to German economic initiatives and not the servant of them. As historian Homa Katuzian has clearly written, quote, Reza Shah was pro-German and pro-Nazi, end of quote. But, one could say, he was not a puppet of the Nazi state. And this message was apparent. The symbolism of this was marked throughout the visit, that he would partner, but he was not a puppet. And he holds to this throughout, at least from what I see from all of my material. As the Shah told Schacht in their brief meeting in November 1936, quote, he counted on German participation in Iran's rapid further development, end of quote. Now, this 5-day visit that Schacht pays to Tehran takes on enormous importance due to the size of the contracts which follow it. And at the center of the discussion is a specific plan that's drafted by Schacht's colleague, a man named Felix Wohlthat, who's one of these second-level diplomats who's actually very important. Schacht had made him his deputy general plenipotentiary for the war effort. And later on, when Schacht is moved out of the Nazi system, Hitler decides later on that he's too cosmopolitan and puts all the war economy issues over with Hermann Göring. Felix Wohltat, this guy, then moves over and works in Göring's office. So he moves a lot of things. Anyway, he drafts this plan, and he gives it to Davor during the visit. Now here, the drive to war was apparent, at least from the Nazi side, in the greatly expanded volume of goods. This is an enormous contract. Iranian exports to Germany are to be expanded from 80 million over 4 years. Now, with this new contract, it's to be 50 million marks in 1 year, 1937, and then the same amount or more in every year after that. In exchange, German firms, so what would the Germans do? They were going to build industrial facilities and infrastructure in Iran. What is listed? A whole number of things: refineries and storage facilities for the oil industry, a network of medical clinics and a new Tehran hospital, a large-scale irrigation system in Khuzestan, ports and harbors, and the expansion of the road, rail, and air network. Now, a number of these projects don't materialize. Plans to irrigate Khuzestan. The Germans had been wanting to irrigate Khuzestan since about the 1880s. These plans failed again at this time. Others run into practical difficulties, but a lot of these things, or a lot of pieces of these things, then are put into place. They do move forward on this enormous plan. And the vision behind it and the mutual interaction at its center provides the foundation for further involvement. Now, Schacht was known for his cold and imperious manner. This is a cartoon where Schacht is shown to be the dictator over the dictators, where he's there, and that's Göring and Goebbels and Hitler supposedly cowering in front of him. This is quite friendly. I mean, he was an incredibly imperious and authoritarian personality with a lot of power in the Nazi system, but he certainly wasn't larger than Hitler. And he had a famous struggle with Göring over sort of power in the system, which is one of the ways in which by 1939 he was out, which is actually why he gets acquitted at Nuremberg, because by the time the war starts, he's no longer part of the Nazi elite. He's already been moved out. So that was one of the big reasons for why he's acquitted, even though he was central in building the dictatorship and readying it for war. In any case, he's known for a cold and imperious manner, but he's a surprising hit in Tehran, where he proves himself capable of charm. At the dinner hosted by Davor, and with the speech that he gives, he said, and I quote, "The news of the invitation from the Imperial Iranian government provided me with the greatest possible pleasure." And he continued by saying, "I can assure you, Excellency," speaking to Davor, "that I received this honorable task with even greater pleasure, as it has long been my wish to visit this country, which can look back on an ancient history of great depth, while simultaneously, under the leadership of a man of extraordinary ability, take an unparalleled leap forward in the space of a few years. The will to awaken the national strength of the people and to place it in the service of common progress is something that our two nations have in common." End of quote. So following the visit, the minister in Tehran, Hans Smend, writes to Berlin that the visit had been a smashing success and had strengthened Nazi Germany's, quote, "systematic offensive to capture the Iranian market." End of quote. So as Smend then wrote, and I quote, "The president of the Reichsbank," meaning Schacht, "succeeded in his various discussions with the leading personalities to persuade them that working together with Germany, in light of the complementary character of their economic structures, will prove to be the best type of business for Iran in the long run. This created an atmosphere that opened the best possibilities for the expansion of our volume of trade with Iran." End of quote. So much could flow from this, and much did, and the relationship surges forward after Schacht's visit. So so the economic contracts move forward and become larger, and cultural and political connections are also mobilized to create support for these economic projects. So films of the 1936 Berlin Olympics are sent to Tehran for viewing by sport and youth associations. State visits are exchanged with the Majlis President Asfandiari traveling to Berlin in 1937, and Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth, visiting Tehran in the same year. While observing hundreds of Iranian boys marching in military formation, Schirach reported that, quote, he was convinced of the modern character of Iranian youth policy, end quote. On the cultural front, Nazi architects designed buildings in Tehran. The Hamburg architect Fritz Höger is invited to design the new stock exchange. He doesn't actually take this up, but he's invited to do it. But the firm Philipp Holtzmann built the central train station in Tehran with its infamous swastika ceiling decorations. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, commissions an aerial atlas of Iran. And by 1937, German firms are actively modernizing the Iranian economy. The German share of Iranian trade rises from a paltry 8% in 1933 to an astonishing 41% in 1939. So the German documents for the period 1937 to 1940, you get details on all kinds of trade deals. Cotton, so an order, November 1935, an order for 2 million Reichsmarks worth of cotton, so the orders themselves are very large. Cotton, fruits and nuts, leather, dyes, pharmaceuticals, machinery, and munitions. For example, the Iranian War Ministry in 1938 puts in an order for Junkers aircraft for the Iranian Air Force. They ordered 20 Ju-86 bombers. So there's also a lot of weaponry coming from Germany into Iran. Krupp is involved in developing the copper mining industry. German companies are producing machinery for dredging the harbor at Anzali. So all kinds of the civilian aviation networks are very interesting too. The firm Lufthansa. Iran, in some ways, has an air travel network before it has a railroad and before it has many modern roads. But all of these projects led one historian to say, and I quote, "From all of these examples, one sees that Germany aspired to a leading position in Iran's industrialization, in the development of its land, sea, and air transport, in its agriculture, and in its military weaponry." End of quote. Now, by contrast, by the late 1930s, Iranian trade with the Soviet Union had almost fully ceased, thus achieving Reza Shah's goal. And the Soviets closed the transit corridors into Iran in 1938. So this brings me to my last topic, and this is, I can talk about these this is Friedrich Werner von der Schulenburg, who is the German minister to Tehran, very important figure in all of this. Here he is with Timur Tash. It's a bit earlier, 1938. Talk about this. This is the signing. Now we're to the topic of the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 and Iran's place in it. And you might be wondering, what does the Nazi-Soviet Pact have to do with Iran? Well, the pact is known most prominently as a prominent political agreement, which it certainly was, between Stalin and Hitler, which allowed for the partition of Poland and for the beginning of the Second World War. But it is that, for certain, but it's more than that. It also creates a vast system of economic exchange. The Pact of August the 23rd was both preceded and supplemented by enormous economic agreements, basically clearing agreements between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. A commercial and credit agreement of August the 19th, 1939, which this is a later agreement. These are the German diplomats who are central in these economic negotiations about the pact, and several of them know each other from their work together in Iran. They have Iranian expertise. Schulenburg is important there. But with the pact itself, there is a commercial and credit agreement of August the 19th, 1939, that's signed 4 days before the political pact and creates the foundation for it. So this agreement exchanged 200 million marks of German military equipment for a corresponding amount of Soviet raw materials. And it provides this practical foundation for then the political rapprochement of 4 days later. So between August 1939 and the German attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941, there's a whole series of incredibly large commercial and credit agreements that arrange for transfers between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union totaling over 600 million marks. So it's in this sense that historians have said that the pact has what they called an economic rationale. One can even take the radical step and say that the pact is a giant clearing agreement. Now, the August 19th agreement and then the supplementary treaties to the pact, so the Border and Commercial Treaty of 1939, Economic Treaty of February 1940, Economic Treaty of January 1941, these are between Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. They connect the war economies of the two parties, which is something which looks incredibly perverse in hindsight. Basically, they're arming each other before the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union. Germany exchanges military technology and weaponry with the Soviet Union for what were called war economic necessities: oil, iron ore, manganese, chrome, and platinum, also for the making of high-level steel and grain. So these are the commercial agreements in the pact, and what they also do is they map out a vast trade area, a vast German-Soviet-controlled trade area, which includes Iran. So Iran is inside of the system, even if it doesn't want to be. Now, the economic underpinnings of the pact are understudied. Its non-European aspects are virtually unknown. But the Iranian connections are very interesting because the economic negotiations are the work of two of the foreign office's so-called Russia experts who had Iranian expertise. And they're here in this picture. This is Graf von der Schulenburg, who, whoops, am I okay here? Who's here in the middle, and the guy next to him is Karl Schnurre, who is a director of the trade office of the foreign ministry. The others are Gustav Hilger, who's a Russian-German, who's a translator, and then the man here with the cigarette is Hitler's own envoy, Karl Ritter, who's central in sort of all of these arrangements. And this is in the German embassy in Moscow. Now, Schnurre and Schulenburg are central to these commercial agreements. They had met in Tehran in 1928. Schulenburg was the minister, and Schnurre, this is one of his first assignments. And what they do together is they negotiate the new legal network for the German-Iranian relationship following Reza Shah's abolition of the concessions system. So Reza Shah has abolished the concessions, and so there has to be this new legal framework worked out, which is what these guys do. So they're German diplomats with a deep knowledge of Russian relations, but also Iran. In fact, Schnurre presents, he's the one who travels to the Berghof on May the 10th, 1939, to brief Hitler, Ribbentrop, and the heads of the military on the desirability of economic rapprochement with the Soviet Union. And Schulenburg was supposed to go, but Schulenburg was actually in Tehran for the wedding of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi with Princess Fuzia of Egypt. And this is a picture from a bit later. This is actually from the Cecil Beaton photographic spread in Life magazine in 1942. Now, within the pact system, Iran is now repositioned vis-a-vis both parties, vis-a-vis Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and now has a fiendishly difficult balancing act to perform. Deeply fearful of Soviet intentions, her industrial economy is dependent on German support. Yet, as her politicians insisted, she was not a Nazi puppet. Now, Iran officially declares itself neutral when the war in Europe begins in September 1939. And then she tries to follow an independent course, but this is very difficult. In a parliamentary debate in October 1939, her ministers discussed the country's changed situation due to the war. The British blockade and its impact on German shipping in the Persian Gulf was a real concern. And in this debate, Trade Minister Vassili and Finance Minister Bader set out the opposing arguments. Vassili expressed doubt whether Iran should hold itself exclusively to Germany for its industrial needs, and advocated outreach toward Italy and Japan. He argued that Italian ships were allowed into the Gulf. They were not part of the British blockade. And Japanese firms were invested in Iran. This was a promising sort of foundation. We should build on that, go in that direction. Bader, by contrast, argued for continuing the economic relationship to Germany as vital to the national interest. Trade was to be kept at the 1939 level, and goods could now, he said, be shipped through the Soviet transit corridors because the Nazis are going to pressure the Soviets to open them. At this juncture, Reza Shah supported Bader's argument, claiming the German connection to be central to the state interests. But this is a very volatile relationship. Bader is no longer the finance minister soon after this. It's now General Khosrovi, who argues for tacking more toward the Entente and toward France. So this is all of these pieces are very much in motion, and this balancing act is extremely difficult. So by December 1939, the Soviets reopened the trade corridors into Iran in response to German pressure. And in the fall of 1939, the Nazi economic journal called the Eastern Economy, Die Ostwirtschaft, see it here, reported on the transit of goods through the Soviet Union from Iran, Afghanistan, and the Far East. So this here talks about vast German-Soviet economic planning. This is the fall of 1939. So this looks, like I said, in hindsight, looks very strange. So große deutsche sowjetische Wirtschaftsplanung, so vast German-Soviet economic plans. But then here, transit from Iran and the Far East, sort of all the goods that are now inside of this transit zone, or up here, economic connections with Iran. And you find there are all kinds of articles like this. So with Nazi mediation, Iran and the Soviet Union signed a new commercial treaty themselves in April 1940. So Iran is now a site of German-Soviet cooperation, its economic importance to Nazi Germany now heightened by the British blockade. As a recent summary put it, after 1939, quote, Iran became a significant transit corridor through which the Germans could safely transport important raw materials, such as tin, rubber, and manganese, from Indonesia and Indochina for their military industries, end of quote. In October 1939, the Reich Economics Ministry listed Iran as a, quote, supplier of vital raw materials, end of quote. And in March 1940, the Nazi minister in Tehran, who was an SS officer, so it all goes over to the SS after 1939. This is the SS officer Erwin Etto, who's now the minister in Tehran. He notes to Berlin that, quote, a considerable percentage of Germany's imports of raw materials come from Iran, end of quote. A report from the transport firm Iran Express in 1940 detailed shipments of metals, cotton, weapons, and opium passing in and out of Germany, sort of kind of transiting through Iran. But these amounts, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, because they were vast, that this economic trade system with the pact is enormous. And the amounts specifically with Iran, they're important, but they're also relatively small. At this juncture, one suspects that Iran's real worth to Nazi Germany lay in its quality as a buffer zone, because it shielded Baku and the Caucasian oil fields from an Allied attack. Baku produced 80% of the aviation oil and 96% of the petrol in the Soviet Union. And both of these items, aviation oil and petrol, are central to the Nazi-Soviet trade agreements. Now, between January and April 1940, Iran refused to allow French planes to use its airspace for an attack on Baku. But neutrality also cuts both ways. Iran also refuses to allow Germany to ship weapons across her territory or to use her petroleum to aid the pro-Nazi coup d'etat of Rashid Ali against the British in Iraq in 1941. Iran closed no alliance with Germany, and her politicians sought to maintain her independence in the face of overwhelming Nazi and Soviet pressure. Iran was also capable of pulling the chain against Nazi Germany, they often threatened to go to the Soviets if the shipments from Germany flagged. As Ruhollah Ramazani noted long ago, and I quote, "To Reza Shah, no foreign power could be fully trusted," end of quote. This lesson was brought home in the late fall of 1940 by the, quote, "near panic which swept the country," meaning Iran, the near panic which swept Iran when Molotov's visit to Berlin was accompanied by rumors that in return for a free hand in the Dardanelles, Germany was offering Russia an equally free hand in Iran, end of quote. This was Molotov's visit to Berlin in November 1940, Molotov being the Soviet foreign minister. So there's this panic that breaks out in Iran that the Nazis are going to essentially sell them to the Soviets. And the German Foreign Office then insists to Prime Minister Ali Mansour that these were rumors. But this was a lie. He was lying to Ali Mansour, because Soviet expansion toward the Persian Gulf was indeed one of the items dangled before Molotov in Berlin. So this story of the Nazi-Soviet pact is a very interesting one, and this system had possible benefits for Iran if she managed to preserve her neutrality, which certainly was a very big if in the late fall of 1940. But with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Iran's fate was sealed. She was jointly invaded by Great Britain and the Soviet Union in August 1941 and divided into spheres of influence which were eerily similar to an earlier time, that of the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. So, to conclude, the German historian Hartmut Polger von Steinmann wrote quite some time ago in 1976 in a very important article on German-Soviet relations. He said that international economics are often left out of international history. So that was true in 1976, and I think it's still true today. The enduring strength of the German-Iranian economic relations would be attested to following the war's end. And it's interesting because both Germany and Iran have as nation states very volatile, very jagged political histories. Changes of regime, revolutions, wars, where new governments come in. So the political histories of both states are very jagged for very different reasons. But after each rupture, after each war, after each change of regime, it's very interesting how the businessmen on each side find each other again, and then the connections move forward. And throughout the 20th century, this is largely the case. It's a very interesting story. So the enduring strength of German-Iranian economic relations are attested to following the end of the war. Whoops. Oh, let me go through again. With this picture here, this is Schacht and Mohammad Mossadegh, September the 14th, 1952. So in the early 1950s, so Hilmar Schacht returns to Iran as a consultant to Mossadegh. So in the early 1950s, Hilmar Schacht, who had been acquitted by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg in 1946, he's then put on trial by the Americans. In the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, he's on trial a total of 5 times. But by the early 1950s, he's out. He founds a new bank, and he goes on tour. He returns to Iran in the early 1950s at the invitation of Mossadegh, where he serves as an economic consultant to Mossadegh, but also to governments in Egypt, Indonesia, India, the Philippines, and Peru, and others on issues of national industrial development, currency stability, inflation, national resources, and international finance. So in the last part of his life, he's this international economic consultant. And that's a part of his life that almost no one has written about. But it's quite interesting because the clearing agreements are kind of clearing agreements are still around today. They're very important, and sort of their role in the Nazi economy is something that's often not thought about when they are kind of a large feature of the post-war world. So the connections that Schacht forges in the 1930s with anti-colonial politicians on how to position their emerging economies in the networks of the global economy, these relations are revived and they influence politics and economics in the post-war period. In his memoir, Schacht pointed to this fact, recounting an episode with the British Trade Minister Sir Stafford Cripps on October the 4th, 1946. As he notes, this was only a few days following his acquittal at Nuremberg. And the two men don't meet. At least they don't meet then. Stafford Cripps had been the British ambassador to the Soviet Union during the Second World War, so it's very likely that they knew each other. But at this time, they don't meet. But as Schacht told it, Cripps opened the Economic Conference for the British Commonwealth on this date, and he opened it with the following statement, and I quote, "Schacht will not participate in any of the deliberations or discussions generated by this conference, but his presence here is felt by all of us. It is an open question whether world trade, particularly that of Great Britain, could rise to the necessary level without applying at least some of Schacht's ideas," end of quote. So that was Schacht talking about Cripps opening this conference and invoking his ideas. But it is to say that the clearing agreements were a feature of the post-war economic world, and these connections certainly need further research. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Okay, so I guess I moderate my, yes, yes, please.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. As a child, I remember that my mother always mentioned that in end of 1930s or beginning of 40s, when she was a child in Rasht, it came trucks full of clothing to the center of the city and just download everything, and people could buy very nice clothes for just like $1, and sometimes they could find jewelry in that, and they could become very rich and so on. And she remembered as a child because it was a neighbor who found a diamond in one of those. And at that time, when she told about that, she didn't know what was that, and I think that none of Iranian knew, but now I know that it was like a Jewish or people who were killed in the concentration camp, that their clothes were sent to Iran. Because she didn't know, but she told me always that it came truck full of very nice clothes and just very cheap, and then people could become rich. Sometimes they could find jewelry that was installed in the things. That was fun. I'm wondering have you ever seen somewhere in some literature about those things, like as an export of clothing from Germany to Iran?
I mean, thank you for that. That's very interesting. I hadn't heard that in quite that form before. As you were describing it, I thought this certainly does sound like plundered material taken from the murdered Jews. But then I wonder about the dates. What did you say, the dates? Because that would be a war. That would be something after 1939.
My mother is born 1935, and she always said that she was a small girl, but she doesn't remember how old was she. But probably she would be 5, 6, something, 7 years old, something like that.
Because those kinds of materials in great quantities really are sorry, this is a grisly topic, but the volume, it's really, that's from the wartime, for when the mass killing and the genocide is occurring. And at that point, the Germans are not, when the British and the Soviets invade and take Iran, they seize all the German assets, they seize all these German firms, they actually hand everything over to the Swedes to unravel the German industrial position in Iran. That's all to be done by Swedish diplomats. So huge files in the German Foreign Office, but under Stockholm, if you want to find out how all the companies were wound up. There are approximately, the numbers vary a lot. Some people say there were 2,000 Germans in Iran at the time of the war. Others say 6,000. A lot of them were these German-Russian exiles out of the Soviet Union, who themselves were laborers. A lot of them were building the Trans-Iranian Railroad. So if you count them into the number, they were essentially Soviet refugees who had some sort of German protection and German sort of papers that were given to them by the German Foreign Office. Then the numbers go up to 6,000, and they're put in internment camps. The lucky ones go into British internment camps, and the unlucky ones disappear into the Soviet Union. So after August 1941, there are some Nazi spies running around in Iran, but the SS has some interest, but the big German presence there is no longer there. So I don't know how. I say all this to say I'm not sure how those goods would have arrived, but it's very intriguing.
But because that is my question, because I remember that she said that it came truck in the middle of the town, and then everyone was going there and buying very cheap.
Well, there's an aspect of Holocaust history that is just now being researched, also because the archives were open now, and these were things that really couldn't be researched during the Cold War. The aspect of the Holocaust that's now being researched are all of the connections into the Soviet Union, all of the people who fled. You couldn't flee west; you'd run into the Wehrmacht and the SS. That was certain death. But a lot of people fled east, and the Soviet Union has a very long border with Iran that was not particularly well guarded, and was in places very porous. So there's I'm not quite sure how those trucks would have arrived or who those goods were from, but that's certainly worth following up on. That's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Yes?
You mentioned the number of raw material Iran exported to Germany as part of the agreement. You didn't mention oil. You mentioned nuts and, was oil excluded or...
Thank you. Yes, one would think that oil, that the Germans wanted oil, and they certainly did. But, and this is another perverse part of this story, that the oil is, the Germans don't have access to the oil, also because of the British. But the British, as the Germans are expanding their kind of industrial footprint in Iran, one would think that they would run up against British opposition, but they don't. The British are kind of okay with a lot of this. So, in some ways, I think that maybe if Germany also wasn't going to be aggressive about the oil, you don't see the kind of British opposition to this expansion of what I would see, or what one sees as an expansion of German power into Iran. They don't oppose it, and they work with it. They work with it up until 1939. Yeah, so that's also quite interesting. Yes.
You mentioned refining capacity. Germans were investing in Iranian refining capacity,
Right.
which became a big issue in Mossadeg's regime, and is still a big issue. And so I wonder if you could comment on the investments of Mohammed Shah following the establishment of OPEC in German industries. Some of whom you mentioned, Inge Farben, Daimler-Benz, Volkswagen. There were massive investments by the Mohammed Shah in those German industries.
Mohammed Reza.
Yeah. Yes, well, the refining, this is very interesting because the Germans are late on the oil question throughout. And 1904, the Deutsche Bank had a concession for the oil fields of Mosul, and German experts were sent to inspect this along with the route of the Baghdad Railway, and said there's a lake of petroleum, there's a veritable lake of petroleum here, but the Deutsche Bank was slow to move. The German banks back then were actually quite risk averse, and they didn't take it up, and so the Germans lose out on this. They're kind of constantly losing out on the oil competition. But then they think, well, we'll corner, if we can't drill for the oil, then we'll build the refining facilities, or we'll build the pipelines, et cetera. That will be, so one sees that over and over again, and that's sort of how I understood with that plan that Wohltat gives to Davar, a big part in there is the building of a building of infrastructure for the refining of oil. What goes on with under Mohammed Shah is something I want to look into, because the German commercial and industrial connections continue. There's a very interesting book published in West Germany, 1953, called Iran und wir, Iran and ourselves, which is sort of setting out the historical background for what they want to see now as a new push of West German commercial firms into Iran. And a foreword in it is written by the economics minister Erhard. So, by Ludwig Erhard, 1953. 1953. So this is, I've come at all of this from, I've almost finished my book on Germany and Iranian relations in the 19th century, and then going through the World War I. So, but how it all plays forward after World War II is something that I'm just starting to open up. But it's certainly, the presence is certainly there, and I think that it builds on these earlier connections. But I'm afraid I can't, at this moment, be more specific than that. Yes.
So to what extent could the outcome have been foreseen?
Which outcome?
The outcome that the Germans were eventually expelled from Iran, given that they were, I'm presuming they were relying on their alliance with the Russians. And you mentioned earlier that the British certainly didn't have an immune response to them being fairly active in Iran. But as the war machine revved up, could what happened have been anticipated either by Germany or by Reza Shah and his ministers, who were debating whether they should remain pro-German or not? Because this is really a fundamental reason for the application of Reza Shah being forced to abdicate. And yet I always wonder how much of the landscape could have been foreseen. Because the earliest stuff that, by the way, I really enjoyed your narrative about the perfect match between Iran and Germany. But I don't quite understand or have an appreciation for how much could have been anticipated.
Thank you. That's an excellent question and an important one. A couple of things, like how much of this could have been anticipated by Reza Shah, also by Stalin.
Particularly with the attack, particularly with Germany turning against the Soviet Union. Right.
And there's a whole debate, there's still a debate in Soviet history about how could Stalin not know? You know, why was the Barbarossa attack in June of 1941 such a surprise? How could they not see this coming? And there are various answers to that. With the British, the British, and they do this throughout. You see this also in the 1880s, the 1890s, where they say that Germany can have economic interests, but she can't have any political interests. Economic interests are fine. We can even partner with them. In the 1880s, in fact, when the Germans open their legation in Tehran. They do this with taking advantage of the Russian-British tension over the Indian frontier and the threat of war between Russia and Britain in 1885. The British then say, we'll have the Germans also in Tehran, and maybe we'll build up, because the British were saying we're going to build up our position in Iran, we're going to move trade in, we're going to sort of have this trade zone in Iran South, and Germany will be our partner in the commercial development of Iran. So this is in 1885 that Britain is saying, Germans come in and partner with us. And Salisbury is saying that to the British Prime Minister, saying this to Bismarck. So you see this throughout, that the British are like, German economic investment is fine, but political involvement is not. And they draw a strict line. So in the British, like, how much of this could have been foreseen? There is this narrative that the Nazis were building up a fifth column in Iran, and that sort of the Nazis were building up this big position, and the British give this as a narrative of why they invade, why they attack and invade, that to stamp down this looming Nazi threat in Iran, this Nazi fifth column, which are all the Germans in Iran, but also Iranian sympathizers, that there's this looming Nazi threat in Iran, and that's one of the reasons for the invasion. A lot of the Russian historians, actually Soviet historians working with Soviet materials, have shown that this is a fabricated narrative in many ways. That this fifth column, there is a Nazi presence in Iran, but it's not the threat that it's made out to be. The Nazis were very involved in Poland and in France, and so their position in Iran, they had all kinds of plans, but they hadn't. And they have some agents there, but they hadn't really realized this. So this idea of this fifth column, this imminent Nazi presence, the Soviet sources and the Russian historians say that's a British narrative. That's from, what is his name? The Reader Bullard, Sir Reader Bullard, the British minister in Tehran. This is his narrative. And it's also given as a reason why, because Britain now is going to invade a Muslim country. And Britain has a vast empire in the Middle East, and they don't want sort of what they're going to do in Iran to sort of reverberate more broadly across the region. So they're in to stamp out Nazism. So whether it could have been anticipated, what Hitler was up to, it's said that at the time of Molotov's visit, that this was, Schulenburg and Schnurre and all these guys are running around. This is sort of a more famous picture of the Nazi-Soviet pact with Ribbentrop and Molotov. Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, here's Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, that at the time of Molotov's visit to Berlin in November of 1940, they're all running around making all of these arrangements, and there's an absolutely enormous commercial agreement that's signed in January of 1941. It's the biggest that Germany had ever signed, and it might even be the biggest ever. So they signed this, and the diplomats in the Moscow embassy, they were Nazis for sure, but they did not want a war with the Soviet Union. And so they were trying to head this off. So Schulenburg and Schnurre, it's one of the reasons why they're also creating all these economic connections, because they say that a war, if Germany has a war with the Soviet Union, it will destroy Germany. And that ended up being true. And Schulenburg, in fact, joins the Stauffenberg resistance in 1942. The officers' plot against Hitler of July the 20th, 1944, he's part of that. And he's then hung in Berlin as a traitor, because he's part of that plot. So that Operation Barbarossa was coming in June of 1941 was a surprise to a lot of people. So that Reza Shah couldn't kind of see through these sort of smoke screens. In Turkey, they are having an equally difficult time kind of trying to keep their balance. Do they go toward Britain and France? They actually go much more formally toward Britain and France, or do they tack? They're in danger. Which way would be the best? And actually from the fall of 1940 through the spring of 1941, that calculus seems to change daily. So that's maybe a long answer, but it's an excellent question. But this older narrative about the Nazi fifth column that the British were invading to stamp out, that fifth column in many ways didn't exist, because a lot of the Germans that are in Iran are these German-Russian exiles, and they were refugees, and they were not political people. And they made up at least 3,000 of that total. And also how German they were. The German Foreign Office in Berlin gets very angry at Schulenburg because he's the one that gives them these German papers. He just has them sign a form saying, I'm German. And a number of them are illiterate, and they just put an X. And so the German Foreign Office says, you're giving out German citizenship to people who you don't know if they're German or they're Russian or they're Georgian or what, So, when the British talk about 6,000 Germans in Iran, a number of them are these refugees. So, yeah. Yes?
Thank you. So I'm interested in viewing this chapter of Iran's history in light of, or maybe in comparison of the history of Turkey. I come from the perspective of Jewish history at Stanford, and during this same time in Turkey, there were a number of prominent editors of magazines and periodicals who went to Germany, and then upon coming back, they founded newspapers or periodicals, and they had imported these foreign European conceptions of anti-Semitism and brought them over to Turkey. These are sort of conceptions of Jews that had never existed. Sure, there were some, anti-Semitic images of Jews that existed in Turkey, but these were completely foreign. And so these were kind of perpetrated throughout these magazines. So periodicals. I'm wondering if you found in your evidence any sort of similar infiltration of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda within Iranian circles, within like newspapers or periodicals or things like that.
Thank you. That's a very good question. Well, Irani Bastan is sort of channeling these European and Nazi ideas of anti-Semitism into Iran with this. If you look at, it's a very interesting source. It's this illustrated magazine that's very lavishly produced, and it's Goebbels' propaganda ministry that directly funds it. So through that, you can see that. So yes, I have seen these new ideas of anti-Semitism. The Nazi propaganda also on the radio is viciously anti-Semitic in a Nazi sense. There have been some German writers who've then said that they've extrapolated from this, that saying that this propaganda had a very large audience in Iran. And then I've also seen it written. I've seen it written in German works on sort of Nazism and political Nazism and the Middle East and Iran in particular. They've said that this propaganda was very popular, and then in fact that Hitler was thought to be the 12th Imam. Now that there was Nazi, so my position on this is maybe a little more, it's different, where there was certainly Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda in Iran, and it did have an audience, but I think that the audience for it was rather limited, because the radio propaganda in general, not everyone has a radio. I think that this stayed in a kind of urban space mainly. That Hitler would be thought of to be the 12th Imam is a crazy idea. There was a student at the University of Toronto who worked on kind of radical pan-Islamic Iranian clerics, and they kind of went out sort of in that direction. But they also, you see it said, but I wonder how big the audience. I don't think very many people heard it, and I don't think very many people believed it. But you can find it. You can find it said. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, such a hateful and notorious figure, he pays a visit to Tehran. He's there. He's then in Germany. He has an audience with Hitler. There's now works out that the Mufti was a big propagandist of his own self, and was, he tells Hitler that he basically can bring the Islamic world with him. So he builds himself up like that. But of course, this isn't true. And so it's another one of those things where you can see it written, but if you get deeper into the Foreign Office materials, you see those diplomats, they hate the Mufti. The Mufti creates endless problems for them. The Mufti actually is a problem for them in reaching out to sort of constituencies in the Middle East, because they, like younger, I won't go into the details, but they don't like him because they see him as divisive. His promise to bring the Muslim world with him is false. And they are working with Rashid Ali, and Rashid Ali and the Grand Mufti hate each other. So there's all kinds of, there are all kinds of ways in which this sort of working together with Hitler is loudly proclaimed, but then it doesn't work out in practice, and they actually farm him out to the SS. The Foreign Office is like, we don't want to deal with him. And they send him over to the SS, where he does work together with the SS in setting up these Muslim battalions in the Balkans. So when you get into the archival materials, you get a much more differentiated picture of not just what was said, but what actually was created on the ground. So that would be my answer. But this is something that needs a lot more research.
That seems very similar to the Turkish case, in which people have exaggerated to what extent did European conceptions of anti-Semitism actually find audience in Turkey, and in fact it wasn't bought wholesale by the majority of people. There was very much a limited audience.
Right, or people understand these things. The radio broadcasts happen, but then what people understand from them is a whole nother story. How much, because they're not going to be understood necessarily in a Nazi fashion. People are going to understand them or in different ways. But also the question of Aryanism. Actually, this Aryan identity, you find high Nazi officials and Iranian officials have very different ideas of who's an Aryan. And in some places these come together, and in other places they split apart. Because for a lot of Nazi officials, the Aryans are Northern European, and the only Iranians who are Aryans were the ancient Iranians. And the current Iranians, they call them a sort of mongrel racial mixture. Right? So you find that in the Nazi documents, but you also find other places where this shared Aryanness is used to create, sort of to work together. So you find a whole range of response. There's kind of not one answer to that question. The Iranian bond is sort of trotted out when it's useful, but they actually differ the Nazis and the Iranian officials and scholars differ a whole lot on the whole question of who's an Aryan and who can lay claim to that title. Yeah. Yes, please.
The notion that Reza Shah was a Nazi sympathizer, is there any evidence that other than his common hatred for British, which was not unique to him, populist, attracted him to the German side, as opposed to having any understanding of Nazi ideology and sympathizing for that ideology?
Well, being anti-British actually brings a lot of people toward the Germans. Seeing the Germans as a way to move against the British, that's actually a pretty common theme. What I see with Reza Shah and Hitler, what he admires is Reza Shah hated the Weimar Republic, so deeply hated the Weimar Republic. There were also communities of Iranian dissidents living in Germany, publishing criticisms of Reza Shah in Berlin and in Munich, and bringing a lot of these books and pamphlets were smuggled back into Germany. There were also Iranian dissident groups there were these Iranian communities in Berlin, also in Munich, and in Hamburg during the 1920s. A number of them were kind of sympathizing with the communists, highly critical of Reza Shah. Reza Shah is beating the German minister in Tehran over the head. Or actually not, this is Schulenburg, so we can't beat him over the head. But the lesser diplomats also beating them over the head, saying that Germany must arrest these Iranian dissidents, arrest them, send them back to Iran, confiscate these presses, shut all of this down. And the German diplomats are saying, well, there's freedom of the press in Germany, you can't do this. So we're very sorry, but that's impossible. So the German-Iranian relationship in the early 1930s is on ice. Reza Shah has canceled a lot of the industrial contracts. He's like going to move the Germans out. There's a trial against the head of the Bank Melli, who's this German director named Lindenblatt. There's a trial against him. And then Hitler comes into power in 1933, and Reza Shah, at least what I've read from him, admires this new Germany as an authoritarian Germany and admires its military strength and prowess. So those are aspects of Nazism. But that in a way is to say that Reza Shah would be kind of together with the old Hindenburg conservatives in Germany, who wanted an end to the left in Germany, wanted an end to Weimar democracy, wanted to build an authoritarian dictatorship, wanted to create a German power position on the continent again after World War I. But the Nazis themselves were far more radical than those guys. The Nazis, Hitler uses a lot of those conservatives to build the dictatorship, Schacht being one of them. Then after 1938, he moves them out. And he moves in his more younger, more radical followers, and they then amp up for the war for the war in general, but then also for the war against the Soviet Union. So I'd say Reza Shah is kind of closer. Someone like Schacht would have been, the authoritarianism, the strong state, the end to democracy, the militarism. I think that was admired. Real Nazi radicalism, the Nazis are so radical. One of the reasons why Germany could still have there could still be a positive aura around Germany is because Germany never actually invaded Iran. Iran never got a taste of true Nazi radicalism. So, again, I don't know. That's maybe pieces of a answer. Yes, please. In which year?
I'm not sure. I wasn't alive then. But
I wasn't
one of those years where the radius.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. And there would be the German Foreign Office who would be sort of handling all those things. In 1934, there's this big German Orientalisten-Kongress, the Orientalist scholars. It's the Ferdowsi celebration. There's which was also celebrated in Germany. In Berlin, there's the Iranische Straße, the Iran Street. It was then inaugurated for the Ferdowsi celebration. So there were all kinds of cultural contacts. So that Hitler sends Nowruz greetings. I think there maybe people want to turn Reza Shah into a Nazi, whereas I see him as an admirer of aspects of Hitler's rule, but I don't see him as a Nazi. So, yes, please.
You mentioned the Aryan thought. Did the fact that both Germany and Iran somehow claim Iranian Aryan heritage, did that drive any of the cooperation, or is that something that more people say today in order to justify some of the cooperation?
Well, you see it actually in German newspapers already in the early 20th century when they write about Iran. There's it's a kind of journalistic language also about shared Aryan brotherhood. In the 1930s, this becomes, as I said, it's sometimes a basis of cooperation, but it's often divisive. It's often divisive. There's a very famous German Jewish archaeologist named Herzfeld, who is the director of the Persepolis excavation in the early 1930s. The Nazis say that he's Jewish. His father had converted to Christianity, and Herzfeld was raised as a Protestant. But for the Nazis, he's Jewish. And there's all kinds of sort of nasty anti-Semitic things that are said about Herzfeld also in Iran. But a lot of these are said by the American Arthur Pope, who's his competitor. And he's the one who supposedly Pope puts it in the ear of Reza Shah that Herzfeld is stealing antiquities from Persepolis. And so Herzfeld was in London giving a lecture at that point. He can't return to Iran. All of his belongings are confiscated, and he's then charged with antiquities smuggling. And this happens again and again, and he has to prove how he acquired everything. That the charges are never proven, but they follow him over and over. And actually, antiquity smuggling was a particularly anti-Semitic charge. But Herzfeld had been very popular with the Reza Shah government in the 1920s because he writes about Iran as an Aryan nation, and he interprets this through its archaeological remains, and he says that the history of Iran cannot be written using Greek sources. You have to remove all of the Greek sources, and you have to use authentic Iranian sources, which are the archaeological monuments. And the history of Iran is in the archaeological monuments. So he had been a favorite of Reza Shah's before. But I bring this up to say that Herzfeld's narrative of Iran and its Aryan past is welcomed by the Reza Shah government, but the Nazis hate it. And when they denounce him in 1935 and they strip his citizenship from him, his students and his former teacher write the denunciation letters, and they say that this is a particularly Jewish narration of Aryanness. And so what was really important for the nationalists in Iran, for the Nazis in Germany, is Jewish and degenerate, and shows the sort of essential Jewishness of Herzfeld's scholarship. And so he is denounced. His citizenship is stripped from him, his professorship is stripped from him, and at that point he has no choice but to emigrate. He actually tries to return to Germany, and which you think, what are you doing? This is 1935. But he doesn't. He actually emigrates to the United States, to Princeton, where he helps to build up the study of the Near Eastern Civilizations Department at Princeton. But that's one example where this Aryan, who are the Aryans, what is the narrative of their history? Here you have a German Jewish narrative from Herzfeld that the Iranian nationalist government likes very much and supports Herzfeld for actually quite a long time, up to 1934. And the Nazi government hates it. So these things kind of cut in interesting directions.
Should we do one or two more questions? I think the gentleman in the back is waiting.
Right there, but also this gentleman right here in the front, please.
Well, I have two questions. Number one, could you elaborate on this clearing agreement? What exchange rate was used and how did they determine that? And the second question is about the reclassification of Iranian Jews as Parsi, so they were not subject to sort of prosecution in Germany. Is there any truth to that?
Well, Dr. Abbas Milani has written on that, also with regard to the Persian Jews in Europe who are protected because they are designated as Aryans.
The question is how the Germans reclassified. What method did they use to do that? That these are not actually Jews, but they're Parsi.
But they're Aryans. Because they're Iranians, they're Aryans. And if the divide in the Nuremberg laws is between Aryan and non-Aryan, where the Aryans are the Germans, the non-Aryans were the Jews. But if you're on the Aryan side of that, you are protected. And in fact, there was a community of Persian merchants in Hamburg who were very lucky to then be designated as Aryan after the Nuremberg laws, and so they were not under threat from the Nazi state. It was a bit, one of the ways I've understood this, for example, in apartheid South Africa, it meant a great deal if you were classified as colored or not. And it could be very arbitrary as to what was actually stamped in your passport, but it meant everything which stamp you had. And so for those Persian merchants in Hamburg in the 1930s who were trading with Tabriz, they are able, I'm not sure how they did this, but they were able to be stamped as Aryan. And as long as they kept out of any political issues, they were left alone. And I've talked to some of them, and they've said that, well, we basically kept to ourselves. You know, everything was about the business and the family. We tried not to look beyond that. We had these stamps, and so we were left alone. But that was very lucky that they had those. They had the Aryan designation. So it could be quite arbitrary as to where you were slotted.
But
It could be.
It also follows your thing about the Iranian not being true Aryans, so that it could be Jews and others.
Well, this question of Aryanism, there have been some works on this, and I guess one of the reasons why my answers are kind of detailed is because there's no consensus. Now, you see these different case studies where it goes in different directions as to who's Aryan and who isn't Aryan. But to me, this idea that the Nazis and the Iranians during Reza Shah's time sort of understood each other unproblematically as Aryans is not true, because it's a kind of power claim that you are Aryan, and the Nazis lay claim to this, and for them the Aryans come from the Baltic.
Are Nordic people.
Right, exactly, and so they come from the Baltic and they migrate south, and so. Zoroaster, you find these bizarre Nazi interpretations of Zoroaster as a Nordic shaman. Okay, so Zoroaster is no longer Persian. Zoroaster is Nordic. He's Baltic, right? So it's a kind of claim to world historical status that the Nazis are making, and it's also a claim for a racial interpretation of world history. So scholars like Herzfeld understand Aryanness in terms of culture and language and history. But for the Nazis, it's all about racial substance, and they have radically different narratives. So this stuff about Zoroaster being a Nordic shaman is truly weird stuff. It's very, very odd. But you find these narratives. With the clearing agreements, what was the exchange? That's a very interesting question. Because since each country paid in its own currency, and they ran these big lists or sort of these credits and deficits against each other, there isn't really an exchange mechanism.
So it was totally arbitrary?
It's not arbitrary, and the Germans also, the greater power of the Germans in these relationships then becomes apparent when they seem to have a lot of leverage in setting the price, sort of in driving down the prices of the raw materials. But the actual lists are kept, like on the Iranian side it's in Rial, and German side it's in marks. And they run these sort of, they run up credits and deficits with each other. By 1938, Schacht is quite proud of this, that the Germans have 500 million marks of surplus that they haven't paid for. So there, the kind of unequal power relationship here comes out, where, and also when the Iranians sort of pull the chain of the Germans by stopping their shipments, because they say, we haven't been paid. You promised us all these things. We have contracts for we've ordered all this aircraft. We've ordered all these munitions. We're not receiving it, so we're stopping our. You see this over and over again. There's a lot of, if you get down at the level of basically like the Trade Ministry of the Foreign Office, all of these little problems. A lot of it has to do with the Germans not making the deliveries. They do, but they're not. The relationship has this interesting foundation, but on a day-to-day level, it has all kinds of It's
Was
quite
it
rough.
different to each country that they were running this type of agreements?
Well, the mechanism is the same, but what they're drawing out of each country is different, and kind of the power differential is different. And with the Latin American countries, here the Germans are in direct competition with the United States. The United States hates this, that the Germans have any that can kind of stiffen the backs of the Brazilians against the U.S. loans. And so the calculus, sort of exactly how this works, and the mechanism is the same, but how it works in each case is specific to that case.
That was very clever.
Yeah, I'm shocked was not stupid. He wasn't stupid. Yes, please.
What you were just saying about the Iranians holding back shipments because of this inequality in this exchange. Did you see that after the Nazis showed what their intentions were globally, and then they made these agreements between themselves and the Russians? Did you see in your research that made Iran a little more reticent about withholding this trade? Did they feel in a real vulnerable position then that maybe they had to continue it out of fear of what might happen to them if they didn't continue?
They certainly are vulnerable. I mean, this period between September 1939 and August of 1941 is really interesting. But there I actually see Iran asserting, there were several occasions where it really asserts its neutrality. That it has declared neutrality, it's going to assert this internationally. I see them sort of pulling the chain of the Germans not complying, stopping shipments, but also when, they insist, again, there could be a difference between rhetoric and reality, but the Iranians insist that no weapons are going to be shipped across their territory for this coup against the British in Iraq with Rashid Ali, that they're not going to participate in that, and their petroleum is not going to be used for this. Again, you see this written and stated, but then you wonder how much were they actually able to do that? How much could the Germans just sort of run over them? And I'm not sure about that, but I do, because the Germans were capable of running over a lot of things, but I do see, even in that period where they're intensely vulnerable, the declaration of neutrality is very important. They're under pressure to kind of ally with Germany. They don't. And they do make these demands to sort of assert sovereignty at a number of points when it was not easy to do so. So that also this idea that Reza Shah and Hitler are in cahoots for this Nazi fifth column in Iran, it sort of gives information that goes against that, because you see actually Iran, I see it being invested in protecting its neutrality, but that was very, very difficult at that point. Sorry, there was okay, but can I, okay, please, yes, and then over here.
I had a couple of questions. I'd like to defer to Professor Stronach here, because I think he probably worked with Ernst Hertzfeld.
Oh, wonderful.
Well, I excavated at Pasargadae, the capital of Cyrus the Great, some years after Hertzfeld, of course.
Okay.
And so I've been thinking about Hertzfeld for a lot of my life. And I was very glad you made the points you made.
He was a very interesting figure.
Very interesting.
And an incredible intellect. Great knowledge, very badly, by 1934, he's being badly treated by everyone. I have written an article on Hertzfeld. I found the denunciation letters that others hadn't been able to find. They're actually in the collections in the German Foreign Office. It was the old working archive of the German ministry in Tehran between 1923 and 1941. All those boxes were shipped to Bonn and then they moved to Berlin, and Herzfeld has box 26. I'd be very happy to. I'd be very happy to. Thank you. Yes?
So a couple of questions. There's some disagreement about how many millions of Iranians perished as a result of the Iranian Holocaust after Russia and Britain invaded Iran and took over its resources and food supply, and medicine wouldn't reach people and so forth. So I just wonder, in case you researched that topic, could you enlighten us on that? And the second question I had was, what was the reaction of the Iranians when Hjalmar Schacht went there to tell them, yeah, we classify you as Aryans? What was their, who did he talk to?
Well, Schacht didn't actually talk about Aryanness in that way. That would be, so the Aryan questions were more on the political side of the Nazi bureaucracy. This is the Rassenpolitisches Amt. This would not be Schacht's economics ministry.
But several sources say David Halliday's Iran and other sources, as well as oral history from the older generation. I gathered that, I know that Hjalmar Schacht, his principal mission was economic, but he also carried this message to Iran. And I just wonder who got delivered to and what was the reaction?
Well, Schacht would certainly use the language of sort of Aryan bonds because it helps him, right? And he's not part of Rosenberg's Amt or Goebbels or any of those parts of the Nazi government that are invested in these, what were called Rassenpolitische Fragen, the race political question. And that would be also in the Foreign Office, but in other ministries. So with Schacht, I see when he talks about Aryanness, it's about partnering, it's about bonding, it's about a shared past and a shared future. So this is, so he does use that language, but the Nazi racial sort of theoreticians use it in a much sort of in a different way, and they're the ones who say that the modern Iranians are not Aryans, and in fact they're not racially pure, and in fact they're all he says they're all like mixed with Arabs and they're all mixed with Semitic peoples. This is sort of the Nazi language. So you could see it in different places in the Nazi bureaucracy, different readings of this. So in that sense, it's a question for further research because it has a range. It's kind of a field of inquiry where different people are placing different claims, and sometimes it connects them and sometimes it divides them. But Aryanness in the 1930s is a power political language. So it's not neutral. It's always a very charged claim, especially from the Nazi side. Your other question about after the invasion in 1941?
The Iranian Holocaust, there's different views of how many millions perished.
Right. I don't.
One author claims 10 million perished, not as a direct result of any extermination of Iranians, but deprivation of food and medical supplies and housing and so forth.
Right. I myself would not call it a Holocaust. And actually, millions perishing, those numbers seem quite high to me.
Excuse me, that could be World War I.
Exactly. This is what I was going to say. That this is another untold story. That at the end of World War I, Western Iran is utterly devastated, and there's tremendous famine. And in fact, some of the German minister in Tabriz is writing to Berlin at the time, 1920, saying the situation in Tabriz now, in 1920, is worse than during the war. That we're more cut off. There's greater suffering. There's disease and there's famine. And this was kind of across that region. So, and also illness, deprivation, but terrible famine. And I don't know the numbers who perished, but they were large. So at the end of World War I, that's a story that I think also needs more research.
It's about 1/3 of Iranian population at the time, which would be about 3 to 4 million.
What's that? Well, Western Iran it suffers so terribly in World War I. with the sort of Ottoman German armies on the one side and the Russian armies, they just go back and forth and back and forth. And this terrain is also part of the Armenian genocide. And a lot of the Persian Armenians perish in this. The Assyrians, the Christian communities are destroyed. There are Russian military sources from March of 1915 when the Russians come in and take Tabriz and then are in Urmia and sort of around Lake Urmia and are reporting on that all of the Christian men of villages have been murdered by the Ottomans and that the murders are ritualistic. Like that they're all killed in the same way or they're stuffed in the well, things like this. So the Russian military sources describe sort of Western Iran as not only part of the Armenian genocide, but in some ways almost a laboratory, because this is a couple of months before the conventional date given for the Armenian genocide of April 1915 in Van. So this is the devastation and the killing and the suffering was enormous, and really went from there's fighting over the border already in 1914, and it doesn't end in 1918. The World War ends, but the local wars continue. So, yeah, that's a big story for itself. But I would say that was more World War I. Yeah.
Going back to the question of the racial scientists of the Third Reich.
Yeah.
In your opinion, why was Hans Gunther exonerated in the Nuremberg trials, whereas Rosenberg was convicted and executed?
Well, that's a complicated question. Or why was Schacht acquitted? That's another good question. The charge, the main charge at Nuremberg was not crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity was a charge at Nuremberg, and it was sort of fashioned as a charge. But the main charge at Nuremberg was aggressive warfare and crimes of war. And there was a military tribunal. And so Schacht himself was never charged with crimes against humanity, but he was charged with aggressive warfare. And his role in rearmament and the building of the war machine was the primary case against him. And it was a very strong case, but the fact that he was no longer in office, he was minister without portfolio after 1939, and he still receives his salary, the full amount of his salary, until 1942. But he's essentially not part of the Nazi elite any longer after 1939. So in his case, this and also the British. The British have such a funny role because the Americans wanted to indict him for certain, but the British want to acquit him, and so he's acquitted. But the British also didn't want to have the Nuremberg trial in the first place. They just wanted to execute them all. So the British and the Americans do not always. It's usual to think of the British and the Americans sort of pulling on the same string, but sometimes, like in this case, it was the Americans that wanted an international trial and the British didn't. So, yes, please.
It is known in many circles that Reza Shah was brought to power by the British government. At least many, in some circles at least, they believe that he was a puppet of the British government. It is also known in many of these circles that Reza Shah was a totally illiterate man without much education. So my question to you, I have three questions, but my first question to you is that given some of those opinions, that doesn't it make more sense that Reza Shah's affection and tendency toward the Nazi Germany and Hitler and his aspirations was more inflamed by his hatred of socialism, evidenced by the fact that he actually killed Dr. Taqi Yarani, one of the very first, most famous communists in the Asian continent, along with the group of 53, which happened to be the foundation of the Tudeh party. Once Reza Shah was actually expelled and British got a hold of him, told him, "We brought you as a servant, you didn't do your job, let's get rid of you." That was the tendency, his anti-communist, anti-socialist tendency. That's the first question, that's correct. Second, you indicated that Stalin didn't know or was mistaken. In many circles, it's believed that because the Nazi Germany, we're talking about two different systems, a capitalist system at the height of it, imperialism, and leading to fascism, versus a socialist system, totally different. That is Stalin, knowing very well that the Nazi Germany and Hitler views them as number one enemy to destroy the system. In fact, it was proven by the fact that as the Red Army was approaching Berlin in the final hours of the war, that Hitler...
Could you just ask the question?
Excuse me, sir. Excuse me. I listened to you, so I'd like you to be quiet. So that at the final hours of the Red Army approaching Berlin, actually, Hitler put the young soldiers, the best of his soldiers, against the Eastern Front as opposed to the Western, showing again his hatred for the socialism. That is Stalin's pact with the Soviet Union was not a strategic move, as somehow I understood from your lecture, that it was just a tactical move to divert Germany toward the West, England and so forth, in view of appeasement strategies of Chamberlain and others. And once that strategy, that tactic was actually achieved and was successful, that then Soviet Union led the pack, made the Allied forces, in fact gave 17 million people dead, and by Stalingrad broke the back of Hitler and turned the turning point of the war. Everybody knows that. So do you have a different opinion than that? Lastly, because of your detailed knowledge and study of Reza Shah, have you found in your research, in some circles they say when Reza Shah was being exiled from Bandar Abbas by Allied forces to Maurice Island, that he owned more than half of the stocks of all corporations in Iran. He owned more than half of the land and properties in Iran. And to what extent your research confirms something like that?
Okay. Well, thank you. I will try and answer. I mean, this hatred of socialism is really important. Maybe more important than the shared Aryanness, since Hitler and Reza Shah probably weren't going to agree on that, but they could agree in their hatred of, yes, thank you for coming, in their hatred of socialism. And Reza Shah really sees two Germanys. He sees Weimar Germany that he hates, and these socialist Iranian dissidents, these communist Iranian dissidents who are riding against him, and he's so angry that Germany will do nothing to arrest them. So that this hatred of Weimar Germany, where it's a socialist Germany that he hates, and so this new Germany of this authoritarian Germany of Hitler is the opposite. This is the good Germany, and that's the bad Germany. So the hatred of socialism is quite important, and I think that's how the way that Hitler and the Nazi movement and Schacht as well crushed the left in Germany, and that the concentration camps, the first concentration camp at Dachau, is built for Hitler first attacks the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party. He removes his political opponents. This is in what's called the seizure of power. This is the Reichstag fire. This is the spring of 1933. So the first prisoners in Dachau are members of the German left. And so I think this hatred of Hitler's crushing of the left was part of what Reza Shah admired. At least that's my sense of that. That Hitler is a strong man. That's part of it. So this reshaping of the domestic political spheres is part of it. With Stalin and the pact, I'm not sure I got all the parts of your question, but if you read Mein Kampf, there's no question that Bolshevism is the Judeo-Bolshevism, as the Nazis called it, is the primary enemy. Judeo-Bolshevism as a world. Hitler always talked about world enemies and world sort of apocalyptic wars to the death, where one race will destroy another. So that was always how he talked. For Stalin, with the Nazi-Soviet Pact's a very weird thing, because it's so big and important, and it has these different pieces to it. And the political part is certainly important, but I found it very interesting because I'd always learned about it only in terms of its political side, and not in terms of like all of the ways in which Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union were now going to work together. And this arming of each other is really, really strange. In some ways, I've heard this, it's an anecdote, but it was from the German historian at Oxford, so I think it's right, where he said that because it was German industrial technology that was going into the Soviet Union after 1939, and all of those military installations, because at one point the Soviets dismantle them, take them apart, and they move them. They literally move them, and they reconstruct them behind the Urals. And this is Polga von Steinmann at Oxford. He said that was possible because they were German, and because all of the parts were standardized, it actually was possible to disassemble them very rapidly, move them, and set them up again. So in some ways, that is part of how the Soviets actually come back and defeat. I mean, the Red Army is vital. I mean, without the Red Army against Hitler, the end of the war would have had a very different course. But with the young soldiers, as the Red Army approaches Berlin in April of 1945, the war in the West is pretty well over. Hitler is desperate. Those are not his best soldiers. Those are 11 and 12-year-old boys. That is a grotesque episode where there are those famous photographs of he is sort of making them all into SS officers. These are young boys. He's sending them out for certain death. Those boys were probably dead 5 to 10 minutes after those pictures were taken. So that was... Richard Evans talks about this very well he has this trilogy on the Third Reich, and the third one is called The Third Reich at War. And if you read that, the ending phases of the war, as the Red Army is approaching and the U.S. forces or the Allied forces are approaching from the West, the cycles of violence inside of Nazi Germany get more and more intense. And there are a number... This is the time when Ernst Thälmann dies. Thälmann was the leader of the Communist Party in Germany. He'd been in Buchenwald for the entirety of the war, and he had survived. But at this point, the Nazis go out. They say that basically if they go down, everything is going down with them. And so they had a big hand in sort of the cycles of violence in 1945 are absolutely unbelievable, where Nazi officials go out and clear out jails. They release all the prisoners, but they kill them all, and they leave it the jail with a stack of bodies next to it. And they do this over and over and over. It looks like a moonscape at the end. They also go out and they find people like Thälmann, who they think Thälmann or others, they could be the political leaders after we're gone, the Nazis. So they go out and they kill them all. And the leader of West Germany is Konrad Adenauer, who had been the mayor in Cologne in the 1920s. I mean, the Nazis had removed kind of a whole generation of people. So this sending of these young boys out to meet the Red Army is part of that. I mean, it's just whole-scale, it's complete nihilism, whole-scale destruction at the end. And Richard Evans does the best job of anyone I've read in describing that. The third, I'll just be very brief here. The third, I see Stalin signing on to the Nazi-Soviet Pact completely as a tactical move. He was buying time. And he knew he was buying time. I don't think he knew when the attack was coming, but he knew he was buying time. Yeah. That an attack was coming, he just didn't know when.
I just want to say what a wonderful talk you just presented. It was.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming, and I'm glad that you found it interesting.
I think the Iranian community in the Bay Area really missed out on a very, very good talk.
You have it recorded, it's okay.
Yeah, you have it recorded, very good. It was wonderful.
You're extremely knowledgeable.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I do have a detailed knowledge of the German sources, but I also try and put those into these larger contexts and to look at the interactions as well. So thank you very much for your questions, and I found it very interesting. Thank you.